Chapter 27. Nothing to fear but fear itself. When the election of 1932 came around and Herbert Hoover ran for president again, almost anybody could have beaten him. Who wanted to vote for the Depression? But the Democrats happened to pick one of the most winning men in American history. He was a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, and his name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, as he became known. Although only a few people in the country realized it at the time, Roosevelt was a man of heroic character. From his youth, he had enjoyed athletics. He had always loved politics and had been the Democratic candidate for vice president in 1920. One day in 1921, he was stricken with polio and left paralyzed. This single sudden thunderclap of bad luck reduced him from a bouncy, athletic, runabout politician to a bedridden medical patient. A man of weaker character might have given up. But Roosevelt became more determined than ever to be an active politician. An old friend who came on a sympathy visit to the hospital was surprised when FDR unexpectedly gave him a strong, good-natured wallop. "You thought you were coming to see an invalid," FDR laughed from his bed, "but I can knock you out in any bout." People who went to cheer him up found that FDR gave them a lift instead. Sometimes he joked about his affliction. FDR wrote a friend that he had renewed his youth, but what was fortunately a rather mild case of infantile paralysis. But his case really was far from mild. He was never able to walk again. Only after long and painful exercises and by wearing heavy braces did he learn to use his hips so he could get around on crutches. He told his friends that he had an advantage because they were running around. He could sit still and think. He used his long period of recovery in bed to write hundreds of letters to politicians all over the country, not about his personal problems, but about politics and how to build a stronger Democratic Party. All over the country, Democratic politicians valued his advice. FDR made a fantastic comeback. When the Democratic Convention in Chicago, 1932, nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt to be their candidate for president, it was not because of his heroic personal qualities, for he had already proven himself a spectacularly successful politician in New York. In 1928, only a few years after he had been stricken with infantile paralysis, he managed to be elected governor of his state. After a successful term as governor, he ran again in 1930 and won by the biggest majority ever. With his broad, contagious smile, he was a wonderful persuader. He loved people and could make them love him. People cheered up when they saw his jaunty, long cigarette holder and felt his warm, firm handshake. He had all the human qualities that Herbert Hoover lacked, and these were what the nation wanted in that dangerous year of 1932. FDR was no radical. In fact, during his campaign, he was careful not to offend anybody. When he made speeches, he sounded more like William McKinley than William Jennings Bryan. Some people who thought the nation needed strong medicine criticized FDR. They said he was too eager to please everybody. They were afraid that he was simply a pleasant man who would very much like to be president. Those critics were wrong. For FDR had courage in politics just as much as in his private life, and as soon as he took office on March 4th, 1933, he showed it. A new deal for the American people. This was what FDR announced in Chicago when he accepted the nomination. He promised to experiment. The nation and all its wealth were still there, he reminded people in his inaugural address. We are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils their ancestors conquered because they believed and were not afraid, Americans today have still much for which to be thankful. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep. Roosevelt had faith that there were many new things the government could do. "The only thing we have to fear," he said, "is fear itself." His courage and his optimism, like his smile, were contagious. Americans were encouraged most of all because they believed that their new president really would experiment. He would try one thing and then another until ways would be found to put the country back on the track and to put people back to work. FDR began trying things from his first day in the White House. In order to preserve people's life savings, he ordered all banks closed for 4 days while he had his advisors look for ways to restore confidence in them. He called Congress into special session to pass laws for the emergency. Congress, on his urging, arranged special loans to help people pay their mortgages so they could keep their farms and homes till the crisis was over. A fund of over $2 billion helped citizens start new construction of homes, offices, shops, and factories, and thus create new jobs. Congress also appropriated over $3 billion for new government buildings and $500 million for outright relief. New laws guaranteed workers their right to organize into unions. New laws prohibited child labor, set minimum wages and maximum hours. A new program sought to keep the price of crops higher than they would be if left alone. Some experiments were not successful. For example, the National Recovery Act, or NRA, was one of FDR's pet projects. The NRA was supposed to enforce new codes that representatives of business and labor in each industry would make. These codes aimed to keep prices and wages higher than they would be without the government interference. These codes were supposed to tell factories what they could manufacture, how many of everything they could make, and at what price. The NRA did virtually the same thing that big businesses had done when they were punished for fixing prices by monopoly. But the NRA said that antitrust rules did not apply. Small business owners objected. They said the big businesses were simply using the law to protect their own monopoly profits. The Supreme Court agreed with the little guys and declared the NRA codes unconstitutional. The court said Congress was trying to give away the power to make laws, but the Constitution had assigned the lawmaking power only to Congress. Still, most people thought FDR was making headway. By the end of his first term in office, there were few people without jobs. The country was looking up. When he ran again in 1936, he was reelected by a bigger majority than he had enjoyed in 1932. All over the rest of the world, desperate people were handing over their liberty to dictators who promised them food and jobs in return. Only 10 years before FDR was inaugurated, Benito Mussolini and his gang of fascists marched on Rome. They seized the government, abolished democracy, and destroyed the liberties of the Italian people, all on the promise that they would provide more and better jobs. In Germany, too, in the very month when FDR took his oath of office, Adolf Hitler, with his gang of Nazi thugs, became dictator. Screaming slogans of racial hatred and fear, the Nazis destroyed universities. They used secret police. They tore millions of people from their homes and threw them into concentration camps. They murdered, robbed, and tortured. They abolished liberty and decency. But the German people supported Hitler because he offered them jobs and promised them a glorious future. They wanted to enjoy the prosperity that Hitler had promised. FDR had faith that it did not need to happen in the United States. He tried all sorts of experiments, democratic experiments to restore hope and prosperity while strengthening American liberties. He consulted with business leaders, labor organizers, university professors, social workers, judges, scientists, lawyers, and doctors. Anybody who had an idea knew that somebody in the New Deal would listen. Of course, some people accused FDR of wanting to be a dictator, but he never lost his faith in democracy and in the ability of Americans to handle the unexpected. Happy days are here again had been FDR's campaign song. Many Americans wanted to believe that FDR was a kind of magician who could suddenly bring back prosperity. Of course, FDR did not believe government had a magic formula. He did believe, though, that the government could always do many helpful things. Indeed, he believed it had to act. And he believed that the government did not need to wait until the next emergency. It ought to promise people help in advance. Then, if Americans felt sure they would get the emergency help they needed, they would be more cheerful and less worried about their future. This itself might help bring back prosperity and help prosperity alive. FDR therefore proposed a scheme of insurance. While a person had a job, he paid a small amount every month out of his wages, and his employer paid the same amount. This went into the federal treasury. Then, when the worker was out of a job, or when he became too old or too weak, he received back a payment every month. He could be sure that he would never starve. The people who received their insurance payments did not feel they were charity cases, since they had been putting in their own money when they were prosperous. They felt they were only getting what they were entitled to when times were bad. FDR called this Social Security. It aimed to make everybody in the whole society feel more secure. Following the lead of his Republican cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, FDR set up a grand new plan for conservation. He wanted to prevent the soil from being used up or washed away, and so to help farmers make a better living, and he found other ways to preserve resources for the future. FDR enlarged Teddy Roosevelt's idea to include people conservation. The government spent millions of dollars encouraging artists by employing them to decorate post offices and other government buildings. Government programs also provided useful work for young people who could not afford to go to college. One of the most ingenious plans was to conserve the people of a whole region. In the mountains of western Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama, around the valley of the Tennessee River, there lived about 3,500,000 people. Most of them lived poorly. Their land was exhausted. Electricity was too expensive, yet without electricity, they could not modernize their farms or bring in factories to provide jobs. FDR's idea was to build a great dam on the Tennessee River. This would protect against floods. At the same time, the water flowing through the dam would turn generators to make cheap electricity, and the government would turn two old munitions plants left over from World War I into factories for chemical fertilizers. This would improve the farms. These were FDR's plans for the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. Thousands of people in the Tennessee Valley felt their lives were brightened by FDR's policies. Public health doctors rid the countryside of malaria. Librarians sent bookmobiles into the farms. Better houses and better schools were built. Again, some people claimed that FDR was trying to be a dictator. They accused the government of competing unfairly with private electric and fertilizer companies. Yet the experiment seemed a success, at least to the poor farmers in the Tennessee Valley. Of course, it did not solve all their problems, and it required contributions from everyone else in the country, but it showed how much the federal government could do when it flexed its muscles. For many Americans, it seemed hope came back to America. FDR had found ways to cure the Great Depression, but had he cured the disease or only eliminated the symptoms? Many Americans were not sure. Prosperity did not fully return until World War II put the factories back to working full steam. And so they say the real end of the Depression did not come until the war. But many Americans felt the government had learned how to deal with the dangers of unemployment and how to keep factories working in peacetime. Americans had lost many of their old fears of economic ups and downs. That was a gain. The Great Depression proved that the more people were frightened, the worse things became. Americans had discovered a new strength. Through the crisis, it seemed that the federal Constitution had proved adaptable. Some said it had come out stronger than ever. Americans had proved that they could survive their worst peacetime disaster, without spreading hatred, without taking away liberties, and without installing a dictator. This was a great and reassuring discovery. It was as important as anything Americans had ever learned about their land or about themselves.